Hey guys! In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to draw skin using pastels. I'm Kirsty Rebecca and I make drawing and painting tutorials that are easy to follow even if you're just starting out. If you want to follow along with a longer real-time version of this tutorial, I do have that available over on Patreon, so I'll link that in the description if you want to follow along step by step. So I get asked quite often what colours to use for certain skin tones, like for a Caucasian person or African or Asian or whatever the skin tone is. I get asked what are the best colours to use for that skin tone. So I thought I'd share exactly what I do to know what colours to use. Before I show you which colours are the best for skin tones, it's important to know that in reality, each subject that you work on is going to have a completely different set of colors. If you take the same person and you put them in different lighting, like inside a building, outside in the sun, at sunset, in a cool light versus a warm light or a low light, then you'll have a completely different set of colors for each of those images. So there's basically no perfect color or set of colors for skin tones. And the other thing is that you'll use a lot of colors for a portrait. It's not the same color in all of the shadow areas. For example, if there's a shadow on the cheek or in the ear or on the eyelid, they're all going to be different colors in those different shadows. It's not the same color in each shadow on each area of the face. And it's the same for the highlights as well. The highlight that's on the forehead and the cheek are going to be different highlights to the one that's on the eyelids or the nose. You may have some of the same colors over the entire face, but there's going to be different amounts of each color in different areas. In fact, for this portrait, I used close to 30 colors for this piece alone, and about the same for this piece, and I also used about 40 colors for this one. So how exactly do you draw skin tones? How do you know what colors to use and in what area? Those are the questions that I'm going to answer throughout this tutorial. So my first tip is in regards to your preparation. So before I start a portrait, I do a little bit of preparation first in regards to the reference photo. So usually I'll come through and make a color swatch of different areas of the face. So I'll go into a program like Photoshop or free programs online like iPicky, or just any program that you have that has an eyedropper tool, and you can just click on certain areas of the face and use the eyedropper to pick out the color, and then you can make a swatch of that color on the side. If you're a member on Patreon, I actually have a step-by-step tutorial that shows you exactly how I do that in real time, so you can make your own color swatches for any reference photo that you have. I also make a high saturation version of my reference photo. So the reason that I do this is because it really emphasizes the different colors throughout the skin tones as well. So you can see in the high saturation version, there's quite a lot of like orangey reds in certain parts of the face, whereas other parts of the face have a bit more of a sort of blue tone or a cool tone. And you can kind of see in some of the shadows and the highlights how different those areas are. So I like to have that high saturation version so I can a bit more clearly see what kind of colors are in each area. So between these two versions of reference photos, I'll go through and pick out the pencils in my set that match as close as I can to the color swatches and the high saturation version as well. And you're not going to have the perfect colors that match all these swatches unless you have, hundreds and hundreds of different colored pastel pencils or whatever medium you're working in. It's not realistic that you're going to have the exact color match to every one of these swatches, and that's totally normal. All you have to do is layer your colors. So for example, if you don't have the perfect sort of peachy pink color, which I didn't have for this piece, I just layered a few different colors on top of each other. So in areas that were a little bit lighter, I added some pinks and some oranges and some light browns, and I also added some white over the top of that and maybe some purple here and there. And you basically just layer your colors until you get the desired color that you're after. So I usually do a base layer that looks quite scary to start with, just to try and block in where the main sort of shadows and highlights and basic colors are in each area there. And then I'll blend it all out, and then I'll have a look at my artwork in comparison to my reference photo, and I'll basically look at a certain section of the face like the forehead or the chin, and I'll ask myself if the reference photo is slightly more red or slightly more purple or slightly more brown, or is it dulled down a little bit more than what my artwork looks, and then I will make that adjustment on my artwork. And sometimes you'll have to do that over a few layers because you may not get it right first time, and I never get it right first time. So you basically just create a layer of a rough outline of where all the highlights and the shadows and the midtones and different colors are, and then you can adjust those colors as your layers go along. So usually my layering process starts out with a really sort of vibrant base layer. So I usually look at the high saturation version of my reference photo and apply a lot of those colors in the base layer to really accentuate the highlights and the shadows and those bright colors. And then as my layers develop, I will dull down those colors with a little bit more realistic color choices towards the end. And just like I was saying earlier, just tint the color slightly in every layer to try and get it to look more and more like the reference photo as you go along. So I don't know if you guys are the same as me, but sometimes I can be a little bit overwhelmed as to where to start, especially on portraits like this where it can be a little bit complicated with the skin tones and things like that. So to get me started, when I do my outline, my initial outline, so I not only outline the general features of the face, I also do a really rough outline of where the highlights and the shadows are as well, so that when I go and start laying my colors down, I sort of have sections that I can work on. So in this case, I actually started with the eyes because for me, that was the most obvious part of my reference photo. So I picked a really dark blue and I just went straight into the eyes. And then while I had that pencil in my hand, I went into other areas as well, like the gap in between the lips and the nostrils, because those areas were all a very similar color. So basically I picked out a color that was really obvious in my reference photo, added that to that spot that I saw, and then looked everywhere else on my reference photo to see if that color matched any other area. And then I did that with the next color. So I chose that really sort of vibrant orangey color that's underneath the chin there, and I applied that color there, and then I looked at the rest of my reference photo to see where else I could see that color, and then I just continued on that way. So I'll choose the next most obvious color to me and then apply it in those areas, and I sort of did that in every single layer that I did on this piece. So your colors definitely don't have to be perfect in the first few layers, but as you start to develop your piece, you want to try and get your colors a little bit more accurate. So before I share my favorite technique to help you get your colors more accurate, if you'd like to follow along with my longer real-time tutorials where I talk you through every step of the process, then Patreon might be the solution for you. For a small amount per month, you'll have access to every tutorial that I've previously uploaded on your chosen tier level in a variety of mediums like pastel, colored pencil, graphite, watercolor, and more. You'll also have access to the original reference photo, a traceable outline, and a list of suppliers including the exact color names that I'm using, so you really can follow along every step of the way. My tutorials don't skip any stages or cut out important parts of the process, and I will share all of my secrets to help you improve. There's no lock-in contract, so you can upgrade or downgrade to an alternative tier level, or you can cancel your pledge if Patreon isn't right for you. Every month, I will upload brand new tutorials to the library so you can grow and develop your drawing and painting skills and take your art to the next level. You can also join in on our members chat group where you can ask questions or advice and share your artwork and talk to other members in the Patreon community. The link is in the description if you want to check it out. So after I've got a few layers down, I'll actually do a comparison between my reference photo and my artwork. So what I'll do is take a photo of my artwork and then I'll turn that into black and white using my phone or the computer. And then I'll do the same with my reference photo, turn that into black and white as well. And then I'll just compare them side by side. And the reason that I do this is because the colors aren't really that important. It's more about your values. So making sure that your shadows are dark enough and your highlights are light enough, that's more important than getting the perfect color in a certain area. So what makes your portrait look realistic is those subtle shifts in values. So by turning your artwork and your reference into black and white, it takes out that color aspect and makes it way less confusing to look at it as just values. So once you've got your comparison here side by side, you can actually see whether your shadows are dark enough in comparison to the reference photo. So for example, if you needed to darken a certain area, you can look at the color versions of your reference photo and your artwork and then see what color it is in that area that needs to be slightly darker and use those colors in that area. So I do that a lot, not only with portraits, but with other things as well. Like if I'm doing pet portraits, I sometimes do that to make sure that my proportions are right and things like that. So this is a great way to check that all of your proportions are right, whether anything needs to be adjusted before you get too far into your piece, and also to check your values and colors are accurate as well. So portraits are a little bit of a weak point for me. I have to work really, really hard to actually get my portraits to look realistic. So I usually go one step further with that as well, and I will crop certain areas. So like I'll crop the eye or the ear or the nose or the mouth or the cheek or whatever. I'll just crop certain areas and do that value comparison as well in those certain areas, because I find that when you crop it down that small and you compare it side by side, it's even more obvious when you've got something wrong. So whether you've got your proportions wrong or your shadows or your highlights. So by doing this with the comparison between the reference and the artwork, it really makes a huge difference in how realistic your drawings are, because you can clearly see what you need to adjust in comparison to your reference photo. So then I'll just come back to my artwork and work on the skin as a whole, or I'll focus on a certain section, like if my nose was slightly out, and then I'll focus on that for a bit to make sure that it looks the same as my reference photo. And I'll do that for a layer until I think I've made all the adjustments that I need to get my values and my proportions right. And then I'll usually do another comparison as well, so that I'm making sure that I've got everything where it needs to be. And another thing to note is that when you're working on skin, it usually reflects colors around it. So for example, in this piece, the really bright sort of orangey color that's underneath his chin is actually a reflection from his bright colored shirt. There's actually quite a lot of this orangey red color throughout the face, but it's mainly towards the bottom half of the face. So I can see it in a little bit of the ear and the nostrils and sort of the mouth and the chin area, but it doesn't continue too much up into the forehead. So those color swatch samples that we did at the beginning are very helpful to make sure that you're putting in those colors, because like I was saying earlier, the skin isn't the same color all the way through. It really depends on the background or the subjects that are around that portrait, because all of those colors are going to reflect onto the portrait as well. So you want to make sure that you are following those color swatch samples, and don't be scared to add in those really bright colors. If you get to the end of your portrait and you think that they still look a bit odd being that bright, and then you can always dull them down when you get to the end, but always follow the colors that you can actually see on the reference photo, even if they look a little weird in the beginning. And when you're looking at those side-by-side comparisons between your reference and your artwork, that's a really good time to be able to see those really subtle color changes. Like if you've zoomed in on the eyes, for example, there's usually some blues or purples underneath the eye because it's a different type of skin underneath the eye, and you can usually see that sort of blue purpley kind of color under there. Or for example, on this piece, if you zoom in on the nostrils, you can see that there's a little bit of red where the dark part of the nostril fades into the skin color. So if you are struggling to see those subtle shifts of color in your artwork, you can use the color swatch sample, but you can also use those zoomed in comparisons as well to try and see those different colors in there. And the best part about this method is that you can apply it to any portrait of any skin tone. So all of the techniques and tips that I've shared throughout this tutorial, you can apply that to anything. So any different skin tone, or even pet portraits or wildlife or still life, or any piece that you're working on. If you're unsure about what colors to use or how to make something look a little more realistic, those techniques are really going to help you out with that. If you wanted to follow along with this tutorial step by step, where I talk you through everything that I am doing in real time, then check out the link to my Patreon channel in the description below, or there's a playlist on the screen of some other pastel tutorials that I thought you might find useful, so click on that and I'll see you over there.